Hello BookTube. Today I'm talking about Pontius Pilate by Paul L. Maier. In this edition it says a biographical novel. Some of the other editions I believe say a documentary novel. It's essentially historical fiction, but Paul Maier doesn't regard it as simply historical fiction. He regards it as a novelization of history, if that distinction makes sense. So it calls it a documentary novel, a biographical novel. The logic being, he is attempting to write something of a biography of Pontius Pilate. We don't have quite enough information about Pontius Pilate to make a full biography, so he's filling in the gaps with some plausible historical fiction. At least that's his justification for it. But let me back up and start off talking about why I read this book. If you've been watching this channel, you may know that I've spent several years living abroad where my access to English books was limited. And now that I'm back in the United States again, I am picking up all these books that I've always wanted to read but couldn't access when I was living out in Vietnam. And that includes books I want to reread. And this past year I've been going back and requesting from interlibrary loan books that I read many years ago as a youth, books that had a big impact on me, and rereading them, partly to see how well they hold up, and partly just to revisit books that I haven't read in years that had a big impact on me. And this is a book that had a big impact on me many years ago. So Paul Maier is a Christian theologian and was for many years a professor at Western Michigan University, which is out in my neck of the woods. I live in West Michigan. And he wrote a couple of historical fiction books, Christian historical fiction books. So there's Pontius Pilate, which is written in 1968, and then there was a follow-up book called The Flames of Rome, written in 1981. According to the cover of this book, or the back cover, which I think this is one of the early editions, Pontius Pilate was part of what was supposed to be a planned series. If that's true, I guess the series didn't get much past 2 books. It didn't get it all past 2 books. But there are those 2 books. So both books are Christian historical fiction. So they take the biblical accounts of the life of Jesus and the Acts of the Apostles, and they combine that with what was happening in broader history at the time, the Roman Empire, what was happening in Judea with Pilate and Herod and all that kind of historical stuff, to make a novel that is interesting history for believing Christians. And at the time I read these books, I was, I got them out of my Christian high school. I went to a Christian high school. These were in the school library. I was a believing Christian at that time, so I had no problems with them from an ideological standpoint, and was really interested in the history aspect of it. So maybe those of you who come from Christian backgrounds might be familiar with this kind of worldview or this kind of background. I grew up learning the stories of the Old and New Testament as my first entry into history. And then I went to church twice a week. I went to a private Christian school, and the Bible was the basis for for everything really. So we learned the Bible stories, and then we had some teachers or some Sunday school teachers who were able to integrate the Bible stories into broader history. So expand, when the Bible mentions historical figures like Caesar Augustus, like Herod the Great, like Pontius Pilate, and some others. And some of our teachers were able to take those historical mentions and expand on the Roman Empire and things like that. And so the Bible was my first glimpse into ancient history and the Roman Empire. And I was a history nerd from a young age, so I really ate up those lessons that and I believed in the Bible. I believed it was a historical document. So seeing that expanded world from the starting point of the Bible was really fascinating to me. And I had some really good teachers who knew a lot about ancient history and were able to integrate what was in the Bible with broader history at the time. And this historical novel is very much in that tradition. So it was fascinating to me at the time. And I picked these books out of my school library. I actually read The Flames of Rome first, although just because that was the one that I happened to catch my eye. And then I went back and read Pontius Pilate second. But now that I'm rereading them, I'm starting with Pontius Pilate because this is the first one. Flames of Rome I'll reread that one next, and I'll talk about that one in a future video. It's kind of an indirect sequel. It picks up at the point in history where Pontius Pilate leaves off, but the point of view characters are completely different, and it's largely a separate book. But anyways, where was I? So I am no longer a believing Christian. I consider myself a skeptic for several reasons, some of which I'll get into in this review. But I still wanted to reread this. I mean, for one thing, these novels had a big impact on me. And the historical novels of Paul Maier were a large part of the reason I fell in love with the genre of historical fiction to begin with, where you go through and you're reading a novel, but you're learning about history as you do it. And now that I'm going back into the novels that had a great influence on me, and particularly the historical fiction, which made me fall in love with history, Paul Maier's novels, of course, were going to be high on that list. Now, even though I'm no longer a believing Christian, and Paul Maier is taking the gospel accounts of the New Testament as historical documents, I still think that's legitimate to do if you're writing historical fiction. So I think if you're writing a scholarly history, then you have to look critically at everything and say, okay, well, these are our sources, but we can't take anything at face value, what really happened, and you have to deconstruct it. That's the job of a historian. But that's not the job of a historical novelist. I think a historical novelist would say, okay, these are what the sources tell us, now let's work them together into an interesting story. So Paul Maier would not agree with that distinction because he considers himself a documentary novelist or a biographical novelist or whatever those terms he's using. And he backs up all of his narrative choices in the endnotes at the end and cites his sources, etc. So he's doing his best to show support for his point of view. But from my point as a reader, I'm willing to go along with the portrayal here of the Bible, taking at face value because it's historical fiction. And moreover, there's a long tradition of this in Western civilization. So, and in fact, the earliest or certainly the best remembered historical fiction is in this vein, right? So novels like Ben-Hur or Quo Vadis or earlier historical fiction about the Roman era just assumed that the Bible was completely true and integrated the Bible stories with Roman history. So he's writing in that tradition. And I know I'm going on at length about this, but I want to try and possibly sell this book to people who, like myself, aren't Christians or are no longer Christians, because I think it's worth reading as an interesting historical novel, even if you don't take everything in the Bible at face value. But ultimately, I think the audience for this book has less to do maybe with if you're Christian or non-Christian. Although if you're non-Christian, you'll read parts of this book maybe a little bit more critically. But if you're, I think you should read this book if you're interested in this era of history. So if you're interested in the Julio-Claudian Empire period, that period of Roman history, or if you're interested in first century Palestinian history, sorry, Palestinian is the wrong word, isn't it? If you're interested in the history of first century Palestine, then this would be an interesting book for you to check out. So let me, having given that personal background to it, go back to the beginning once again and try and sketch out some brief historical background. So if you don't know, and possibly there are people watching this video from another country or something who might not be so familiar with Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is infamous in Christian tradition as the man who condemned Jesus to death. So there was the Jewish authorities brought Jesus on charges before Pilate. Pilate thought Jesus was innocent himself, according to the Gospels, but in order to, because there was a mob demanding Jesus' death, he acquiesced to the mob and sentenced Jesus to crucifixion. So he has an interesting legacy in Christian tradition, which essentially is most of Western civilization, which is, on the one hand, his name is synonymous with either someone who had condemned Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate in the Christian tradition, to death. And it's made very obvious in the Gospels that he doesn't want to do it, but he's giving in to mob pressure. So his name is also used as an eponym, meaning somebody who's spineless before the crowds, or somebody who tries to absolve themselves of their own actions because they don't want to take a firm stand, or something like that. So he doesn't have a terribly positive reputation in Western history or Western civilization. On the other hand, for somebody whose historical legacy is that they condemned Jesus Christ, the center of Christianity, to death, given that historical fact, he gets a surprisingly sympathetic write-up in the Gospels. So the narrative that's in the Gospels is that the Jews come wanting to crucify Jesus. Pilate believes Jesus is innocent and he doesn't want Jesus to be crucified. And there is a long sequence where he tries several maneuvers to try and get Jesus freed. So first he tries to send him to King Herod. Then he tells the crowd several times Jesus is innocent. He tries to get Jesus to speak in his own defense. He offers the crowd a release of prisoners. They can choose Barabbas or Jesus. He's thinking that they will choose Jesus, but the crowd actually chooses Barabbas. He orders Jesus flogged and then says, okay, look, I've already punished him. We don't need to crucify him now. But the crowd still demands a crucifixion. And then finally, infamously, Pilate washes his hands and says, okay, well, his blood is on your hands, your heads, not mine. And the crowd infamously says, I believe it's in the Gospel of John, Yes, let his blood be on our heads and on our children's. So it is very clear in the Gospels that Pilate is sympathetic towards Jesus, but that the crowd is just forcing him to kill Jesus. In fact, if you were inclined to read those Gospels critically, it does almost seem like the Gospels are laying on this narrative a little bit too thickly. Like they're trying a little bit too hard to convince you that Pilate really didn't want to kill Jesus. And it's been argued by some skeptical historians that this is revisionist history at work. So, what we know of Pontius Pilate from some of our other historical sources, and he is a historical figure, attested to by a few other ancient Roman and Jewish sources, is that he had a reputation for being heavy-handed and brutal, and according to one source, frequently executing innocent people. That source is Philo, I believe, of Alexandria. I'll link to the sources in the description down below. Something like that. So I saw one historian once on a documentary I saw years ago, and I don't remember where I saw this, but he said, I can easily imagine Pontius Pilate during the Passover celebrations just ordering anyone to be executed who was causing a disturbance. And he said, Pontius Pilate was not the charming gentleman that he's portrayed as in the New Testament. So the idea is that, Jesus is this messianic figure. He comes into Jerusalem during the Passover. There's some sort of disturbance being created. And Pontius Pilate says, right, messianic figure causing a disturbance, crucify him. And he doesn't need to be pressured by the crowds or anything like that. He's a very, our other sources portray him as a very hard-nosed governor. But then what would have happened is in the early days of Christianity, when Christians were still being persecuted by the Romans, is that the Romans were trying to figure out what this thing called Christianity was. And the Romans were saying, well, Jesus, wasn't he a criminal who was crucified by one of our Roman governors? Isn't this whole sect illegal and should be outlawed? And the Christians were like, no. Pontius Pilate may have sentenced Jesus to be crucified, but it was the Jews that made him do it. Pontius Pilate didn't want to do it. In fact, Pontius Pilate tried so hard not to let Jesus be crucified, but the Jews just wouldn't let him off the hook. The Jews kept demanding that Jesus be crucified. Pontius Pilate tried everything, and then finally, just to keep the peace, Pontius Pilate agreed to have Jesus crucified. And so the idea that there's this revisionist history to make it look like Pontius Pilate was doing everything he could to try and save Jesus, when the actual history may actually be somewhat different. That being said, of course, all of this is just speculation, and all of this is ultimately lost to the mists of time. Who knows? Maybe for whatever reason, Pontius Pilate, maybe he was having a sympathetic day. Maybe he's actually not quite the villain he's portrayed as in these other sources, which, by the way, is what Paul Maier is arguing in this book. So maybe something like what is portrayed in the Gospels actually happened. So that's me as a skeptic, kind of laying the case against the portrayal of Pontius Pilate as it's in the Gospels. Paul Maier is a Christian, so that's not the case he's making in this book. He is trying to portray a sympathetic Pontius Pilate who is congruent with the portrayal that's in the Gospels. if you're a skeptic, you can maybe read this portrayal skeptically, but that's what you're getting in this book. So, what are the sources for Pontius Pilate? So, one of the things about coming back to these books now, when I first read this book, it was in the early 90s, and there was no Wikipedia, there was no internet. There were the notes in the back, but unless you had access to a university library, you weren't going to look up all the ancient sources. Now, all those ancient sources are online. So when Paul Maier cites a text from Josephus, a Jewish historian of the first century, all of Josephus is online. You can just Google that text, Google the exact chapter of Josephus he cites, and you can read it. There are a handful of accounts of Pontius Pilate from Josephus, and then one more from Filio, another Jewish source. Apologies for the confusion on the name. And you can go online and you can read everything there is to read about Pontius Pilate outside of the Gospels in about 10 minutes. And I'll link to a site in the description down below if you want to do that. There's a site on Livius, a page on Livius that collects all the documents, all the sources on Pontius Pilate. Aside from the crucifixion of Jesus, which we get from the New Testament, there are 4 other incidents in the life of Pontius Pilate. So there's one incident when Pontius Pilate has his legion display pictures of the emperor Tiberius on their banners in Jerusalem. The Jews object to this. They say that displaying images is against Jewish law. This is sacrilege. They go and protest to Pontius Pilate in Caesarea. Pontius Pilate gets annoyed by the Jewish protesters. He says, all right, I've had enough of you. Clear out, or I'm going to send the soldiers in to start killing you. And the Jews, instead of clearing out, just offer their necks to be slain. Say, we're willing to die for this. Pontius Pilate at this point backs down and removes the standards, the pictures of the emperor from the city of Jerusalem. There is another, that was from Josephus. There's another incident from the Philo, the other guy, which is a golden shields incident, which, as discussed on Wikipedia and also in the notes of this, may be the same incident, kind of slightly told in a different way, or maybe a separate incident. In this historical novel, Paul L. Maier treats it as a separate incident. And this incident is very similar, except this time it's golden shields that Pilate has put in the palace at Jerusalem, which are offending the Jews. Similar thing, there's a confrontation with the Jews. The Jews appeal to Caesar in a letter in which they say all the crimes that Pilate has given. Pilate knows that he's been guilty of all these crimes when he's been in the prefect of Judea. And according to the letter, it's killing innocent people, it's stealing property, it's generally being a tyrant. He's been doing all these despotic and evil things, and he doesn't want Caesar to know about this. Caesar gets the letter and rebukes Pilate very strongly, and then Pilate has to take down those shields. Another incident which we get in Josephus is that Pilate builds a aqueduct, those famous Roman aqueducts, to the city of Jerusalem, but he pays for it using the money from the Jewish temple. When the Jews find out that he has stolen money from the Jewish temple, there is a riot. Pilate puts it down violently by having his soldiers go in and club people. Pilate does tell his soldiers not to use their swords, something which is mentioned in Josephus and mentioned in this novel, but some people get killed anyways during the violent suppression of that protest. And then the other one mentioned in Josephus, there's a group of Samaritans who are following a messianic figure. This is another messianic figure. I guess there were a lot of them in Palestine at that time. And they were going on a pilgrimage. They were armed. It looks like insurrection. Pilate took his troops out, and there was a battle with the Samaritans that the Samaritans lost, and then Pilate had several of them executed after they had been taken prisoner. The Samaritans then sent an embassy to Caesar complaining about it. The embassy actually went to Syria first, where the Pilate's direct superior was. It gets a little complicated. It's all explained in this historical novel, kind of the chain of command. And then Pilate was relieved of duty. That was the end of his career as the prefect of Judea. And then he had to go back to Rome to stand trial before Tiberius. But Tiberius died before he got there. And so presumably the trial was never heard. Aside from later church traditions, that's kind of the last we know about the historical Pontius Pilate. And all of those incidences I mentioned are in the novel. And again, you can go to the web and read them for yourself. It will take you all of 10 minutes to just read the authentic passages from everything I just described. So you can see perhaps that Pilate is not coming off particularly well from those incidences. And depending on your point of view, may not be the person described in the Gospels who is so concerned with saving one innocent man that he spends all this time trying to talk the crowd out of it. But what Paul Maier does in this biographical novel, this historical novel, is he goes through all of those incidents I just mentioned and imagines them from Pontius Pilate's point of view, and fills in the backstory that may be missing. So, may be missing from the historical records. So I cited 4 of them. I'm not going to go through all 4 of them, but just to talk about the aqueduct. The aqueduct one, when the Jews threw a riot because they found out that Pontius Pilate had stolen money from the sacred temple to fund the aqueduct. In this novel, Pontius Pilate is not a tyrant. He's a good governor who wants to improve the city. He realizes Jerusalem has a water problem. He investigates what to do about it, decides that needs an aqueduct, and he has the aqueduct built. So he's improving the lives of the people, giving them more water, improving the city. But somebody's got to pay for the aqueduct. And the Jewish people and the Jewish authorities make it crystal clear to him that they do not want taxes raised. So Pilate finds out about a fund in the temple. Now the temple has a lot of money because people are making donations. They're collecting money from the citizens, and Pilate thinks, okay, well, why shouldn't the temple pay for some of this improvement to the city? And in fact, according to Jewish law, the money from the temple can actually be used to build some of the foundations around the city of Jerusalem, or it can be used for some of the upkeep of the area and the city. So Pontius Pilate gets the Jewish authorities to agree to it, which is not in Josephus, but as Paul Maier points out in his notes here, there's no way they wouldn't have agreed to it. I mean, they must have known that money was coming out of the temple, right? Because they were the ones who had to give it to them. In the novel, the Jewish authorities only give it to him in secret and on the condition that if it becomes known, they will disavow all knowledge of it, which maybe is plausible. So, you can see in this novel how Pilate is not really a tyrant. He's trying to improve the lives of the Jews. He's frustrated by lacks of resources. He's trying to negotiate all these silly rules that they have. And the other incidents are told in a similar way. I've got a lot more to say about this book, so I'm going to make this a two-parter. The camera I'm using only films for 30 minutes before stopping, and I know I've been rambling a long time, so if you're sick of hearing me ramble, fair enough. If you want to hear more thoughts on this book, I'm going to put up a second video.